relevant, reliable, and researched. This is Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering leading-edge news and information on today's most beneficial products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM650.
And welcome back to Key Pacific's Talk About Strata. Producer Art Factora jumping in with the Beatles, and our musical director Tony Gioventu heartily approving of that choice to reintroduce this segment. Adrienne Murray is a lawyer who practices in strata law in White Rock. It's delightful to have you back on the program. I'm Sterling Fox. Tony Gioventu and I are really just kind of stunned, me particularly, because Tony's been at this a lot longer than I have, Adrienne. The fact that most people, by the sounds of things, an enormous, ridiculous majority of people who drop insane amounts of money on condos and strata units around town, around the province, don't have any of this reviewed by a lawyer. So let's assume that I'm going to try and be the minority, the smart few, who actually think having a lawyer walk me through this ridiculously overpriced experience would probably be a smart idea. So what is the lawyer going to want from me when I sit down with you? And I've been to this place, and oh boy, we're really close to buying it. So you're going to ask me for what?
Well, I'm going to take a look at the contract that you've entered into. You've got a rescission period if you're buying from a developer, so we've got time to walk away if that's our conclusion.
Okay.
I'm going to take a look at the disclosure statement that's going to talk about the parking and the storage, and it should have a preliminary strata plan. So that's the information I'm going to get to get started.
Am I likely to have made a cash deposit of some kind by this time already?
You probably have.
Really?
You've probably,
okay.
I mean, you may or may not. It depends,
Right.
Again, on the days where they were lined up around the block, you wouldn't walk out without having a contract
Of course.
and some deposit. These days, not so much.
Pressure seems to be off in that regard.
It's a little different market. So as a lawyer, and let's focus again on parking and storage, I'm going to look at what the designation is, what's the developer saying. And let's cut to the chase with the common property. The developer says the parking and storage are common property. And I promise you, Stirling's parking stall 22. Well, now my question's going to be, how do you guarantee that for my client?
Right.
And you're going to either tell me that you've entered into a lease, and I want to see a copy of the lease.
Mm-hmm.
It should have been described in the disclosure statement, and we will see that lease is entered into. And alternatively, the developer may say, I intend to make it limited common property for Stirling.
Okay.
So
do you need a note, some written letter of intent?
Well, we're going to do more than that. We're going to make it a term of the contract, and that the contract is not going to be enforceable unless that parking stall and storage locker are designated for you.
So it becomes a subject.
It's
and this is a pretty common real estate term. We're going to do the deal if all the subjects are covered off.
So the developer has up to almost a year to file that, create that limited common property, and you're going to have an ability to walk away if that doesn't happen. So that's how we're going to write up the contract. So at the end of the day, you're going to either have a limited common property parking space, or you're going to have a lease of the common property. And that now will guarantee you anything less, and you have no assurance of the use of parking.
Okay, and a storage locker, I'm assuming, falls basically into the same category.
Exactly in the same way.
Same description and assignment and all of that.
Exactly. So now, once you've done that, you know what you're going to be able to sell when you want to resell the strata lot.
And that's the long horizon stuff, Tony, that you were talking about earlier. And it's very exciting and very emotional to get into this new thing, but it's also prudent to probably think that you're not going to be there forever.
Well, and think about it from the Strata Council's perspective. At some point, and whether I'm the Strata Council, I might be the Strata Manager representing the Strata Corporation and providing information certificates. At some point, one of these units is going to resell. Mm-hmm. And there may be all kinds of parking designations. It could be a lease. It could just be random common property. It could be LCP assignments on the Strata plan. They could be part of a Strata lot. As the Strata Corporation, I need to now put together a parking plan. I need to understand how the parking is allocated and who's using it, because I'm going to have to disclose that information with respects to a Form B information certificate. If it's common property and random use, that's all that the answer is going to be likely, that it is common property and it is allocated randomly by Strata Council, or it's simply random use. We do have buildings where parking is not assigned to anyone. People just park randomly when they come in. It's common property. We have we have buildings where strata corporations do exclusive assignments once a year. So they have a parking plan that they may make changes through in the year, and once a year they approve it as a rule of the strata corporation because it's common property, and everybody knows where everybody's supposed to park.
And every now and then
there's a
you
designation.
may get your spot changed, but you've still got to get a spot.
It might change for a variety of reasons, for access, for size of vehicles. You know, a number of the parking garages, as you go further down, have very tight turning corners, low clearances, smaller parking spaces. You might have to have a reallocation based on the size of the vehicle that you have.
True.
You might have to have reallocation based on special needs access or some issue that's required for the building. So the Strata Council has to start putting together these plans. And really our message is start now, and hopefully by the end of the year, come January 1st, you're going to have parking plans and storage locker plans. And you'll understand how these are allocated. Understanding how they're allocated is going to take a bit of detective work though. Because what if the developer assigned or created a lease and then assigned the lease and leased the parking spaces? In most cases, we don't see that information of parking assignments being given to the strata at their first AGM.
Right.
So who knows about it?
Right.
It's not registered. We know there's a clue from the original disclosure. The original disclosure will have a draft of what the parking lease or parking assignment looks like. So we know they probably existed. So the Strata Council is probably going to have to do some detective work. They can certainly contact the developer originally and ask them if that information is available. If it's not, or the developer is no longer in business, or they're incapable of providing it, the Strata might have to do an inventory of the building. Literally ask everyone who's parked in the building, which are your parking spaces, how were they assigned, do a survey of the building.
Right.
How were they assigned, did you have parking leases, did you have agreements, could you provide us with copies of those agreements, something so that they can start to reconstruct the whole parking and storage locker allocation. Because they're going to have to be able to tell buyers when they come along how this parking's allocated.
Sure.
Right?
Well, and just to be clear, the deadline for this is January 1st, 2014, which really isn't that
It's only 10 months
far away.
Exactly.
Because the deadline is arising because this information now has to be on the Form B information certificate. So just to be absolutely clear that stratas don't have an option. The government has changed the Form B information certificate that every strata corporation has to complete if requested. And that form now must indicate information about parking and storage.
Quick consumer question for you, just straight wallet question. If I'm going into a building where every unit comes with a parking spot, and I don't want to drive, I'm going there because you're right beside a SkyTrain station and I'm done driving. So I don't want a parking spot, and yet my unit comes with one. Can I say I don't want a parking spot and negotiate the price down because the price is supposed to include a spot?
Well, again, that would be how it was designated. If it's limited common property and it's on a strata plan, you're not going to change it because it's essentially carved in stone. If it was installed by the developer, it's a unanimous vote. It is what it is. Now, what you might be able to do once you bought the strata lot is rent it to somebody who needs an extra space. If it's a lease, again, you might be able to rent it. Very often, these lease arrangements require that every strata lot maintain at least one parking space. So you're not going to be able to get rid of all parking spaces just because you don't want to drive, but you might be able to negotiate some sort of rent for it. If it's simply common property, it's up to the Strata Council anyway. It's not going to really impact your price. It's a Strata Council decision.
Right, so there's not a lot of negotiating room there, then, is there?
Probably not.
Okay.
Probably not. Not on a resale.
I just thought it was, it's a question that it seemed reasonable to ask. If the unit comes with a spot, and I don't need a spot, I should pay less for the unit. Give somebody else a spot. That it seems to make sense but then a lot of things that seem to make sense, Tony, as you and I discover in our conversations, really it just seems, underline that several times, because it may not even come close.
Well, you might not want a spot now.
Yeah.
You may want a spot in the future. Your living circumstances could change. But at some point, you may also be selling your unit, and that parking space to your unit could be extremely valuable.
Sure.
Right? It could be quite a significance in your ability to sell your strata lot. So, or even rent. You may turn around, you might want to rent your unit. Having a parking spot for a tenant can be just as important with respect to your unit. So, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily just dismiss the removing a parking spot because I can get a slightly better deal on the unit.
Right.
I don't think it's going to change the value of your unit. I think that what you'll find is that you will have a diminished value in the long term because you don't have a parking spot available. If you're in a high density area where you have 4 different forms of transit within a 10-minute walk,
Sure.
you probably don't need a car.
Right.
And really there are, as Adrienne said, there are buildings with co-op cars, and we have all types of co-op car use industry that is available throughout the Lower Mainland now. So,
and there's another kind of vehicle that's being introduced into the mix ever so slowly. It isn't catching on half as quickly as the manufacturers were hoping, but we're talking electric cars now,
Right.
and these are going to require some kind of plug-in repowering station. So will the condos, the strata developers of the future, Tony, be including a recharging plug in parking stalls in new units?
We have a research study underway right now on how strata corporations will accommodate electric vehicle charging stations. And the preliminary information is quite interesting because the first thing you have to establish is where are the charging stations going to go?
Okay.
Because those are going to have to be designated parking spaces for charging stations. And do you even have available parking that you could allocate for charging stations in your building? If you're in a building where the developer through leases assigned all of the parking, you may not have the strata
You may not have one even to put a recharging station.
You might have visitor parking.
Yeah.
The visitor parking may be in areas that's not secure. There might be other restrictions to it. You might have all the underground parking totally allocated so you don't have a space. You might have to coordinate with the owners and negotiate a solution regarding it. It's a little bit of a catch-22 also. If you own an electric vehicle, you're obviously only going to be interested in buying in a condo or a development where there is a charging station.
Sure.
And if you are in a building without charging stations, you will likely never buy an electric vehicle.
Well, that's true.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's this little catch-22 problem that's happening, but the strata has to figure out now who's going to install the charging station. Is it the strata? Is it an owner requesting it at their specific parking space?
Right.
What type of electrical modifications are going to have to be done? There are going to be some construction. Is the building's electrical system new enough and have capacity to be able to hand 1, 4, or 10 charging stations? Do we actually have capacity in the building system to be able to do this?
And I would think also from a common property point of view, would this not have to, Adrienne, be submitted to the strata community for a vote? Because what do I want my condo fees to pay for somebody's electric car recharging unit when I don't like electric cars. I'm against them in principle, or whatever silly reason I have, right? Is that likely the way that these recharging stations are going to come about?
It may not even be. I mean, it may require a 3/4 vote just to create the charging station in the first place,
Right.
because it's a significant change in the use or appearance of common property. A provision of the Strata Property Act requires that any significant change to the use or appearance of common property requires a 3/4 vote of the owners. So ultimately, you're going to have to get the owners to agree as a collective, as a 3/4. But there's still, I think, the issue of cost allocation, because even if we do agree, I still may not want to have to pay for your
Exactly.
electricity.
Yeah,
So we
exactly.
need to find a way to meter the use of that electricity and to be able to allocate it through to the owner who's using it at the
Right.
time, in some mechanism that permits that strata to actually charge those fees and obligates the owner to pay them. And those are issues today that still are not so clear under the Strata Property Act.
Interesting.
There is technology now, which is a good solution, but it's still a problem with respect to the legislation. There is technology now. We have off-the-rack charging stations, right? We have companies who literally come in and install them, and they're designed with a swipe card system. So either your Visa card or a prepaid card that's loaded, so that the electricity that's drawn from the Strata's resources
He's paid by the user.
is paid by the user and reimbursed back to the Strata Corporation. So there are methods of doing that, but But a lot of that depends on what the designation of the property is too. If it's common or limited common property, it can be created through user fees. So we can come up with some kind of structure, and it's going to have to figure out how to work it within the mechanics of the legislation. But what if it's a strata lot? And you are now, because you cannot impose separate user fees on a strata lot. It's common expenses are based on unit entitlement. Right. So what if the parking space is a strata lot, and now we want to impose this concession or this user fee? We're going to have to think of some other creative ways of finding a solution to how to set up those charges for those users.
This is Key Pacific's Talk About Strata on Experts on Call on AM650, and we'll be right back.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.